I kind of like Diddy.
And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, Beyonce, Oprah Winfrey, Kim Kardashian, all of them were Diddy's handlers.
People say 50 Cent is just joking, that he likes attention, that he trolls everyone, so none of it really means anything. But here's the problem with that idea. Jokes don't repeat themselves for years. Jokes don't show up at the exact same moments. And jokes don't circle around the same person again and again unless there's intent behind them. This story isn't about accusations. It's not about proving anything. It's about something far more uncomfortable. Patterns. Because when you step back and you stop reacting emotionally and you just watch quietly, you start to notice something strange. Every time Diddy's name enters a serious conversation, 50 Cent is never far away. Not shouting, not explaining, just smiling, posting, laughing, and the internet laughs with him without asking why. 50 Cent has survived too much to be careless. And the streets didn't forgive mistakes. The music industry didn't either. People like him don't speak randomly, especially not in public, and especially not about powerful people. So when someone like that keeps circling the same name, using the same tone, at the same moments, it stops being noise. It starts feeling deliberate. What makes this even more interesting is that 50 Cent never says what people expect him to say. He never finishes the sentence. He never gives context. He never clears the air. He lets the silence do the work, and silence is dangerous because it forces people to think. Over the years, fans have argued about this endlessly. Some say it's just comedy. Some say it's clout. Others believe it's something closer to a warning. But here's the part most people miss. 50 Cent doesn't joke like this about everyone. When he doesn't repeat the same behavior with every celebrity, there's no long-running pattern with most names. But with Diddy, the behavior is consistent. Consistent timing, consistent tone, consistent restraint, and restraint matters. Because if this was about attention, he would go all the way. If this was about beef, he would escalate. If this was about hate, he would explain himself. But he does none of that. Instead, he drops hints, lets them sit, and walks away. Almost like he knows that saying less will do more. There's another detail that makes people uncomfortable. 50 Cent doesn't look nervous when he does this. He doesn't look angry. He doesn't look emotional. He looks calm. And calm behavior around powerful people usually comes from one of two places, either complete ignorance or complete confidence. And 50 Cent is not ignorant. So when people ask, why does 50 Cent keep warning people about Diddy? The better question might be, why does he feel comfortable doing it at all? Because in an industry where most people stay quiet, where silence is survival, where saying the wrong thing can end careers, one man keeps laughing. And laughter, when it's timed perfectly, isn't comedy. It's communication. This isn't a story about what 50 Cent says. It's a story about what he refuses to say and why he doesn't need to. Because sometimes the most effective warning isn't loud. It doesn't come with proof. It doesn't come with explanations. Sometimes it comes disguised as a joke, posted casually, and left behind for people brave enough to notice. And once you notice it, you can't unsee it. And that's where this story really begins. To understand why this matters, you have to understand who 50 Cent really is. Not the memes, not the jokes, not the Instagram captions people scroll past, the mindset. 50 Cent didn't come up in a world where words were free, where you could say anything and walk away clean. Every word had weight. Every sentence had consequences. That kind of background doesn't disappear when the money comes in. It sharpens. People who survive environments like that learn one thing early: say less, watch more, and never speak unless you mean it. That's why 50 Cent has always been different from most celebrities. He doesn't rush to explain himself. He doesn't correct narratives. He doesn't chase approval. When he talks, it's measured. When he jokes, it's layered. And that's not accidental. In interviews over the years, 50 Cent has said variations of the same idea. That the industry isn't just about talent, it's about power, about who controls access, about who decides who gets opportunities and who doesn't. He's talked about people being afraid to say no, afraid to speak honestly, afraid to be seen as difficult. But he rarely names names. That's important, because naming names is emotional. Avoiding names is strategic. 50 Cent understands how systems work. He understands how narratives are protected. And more importantly, he understands how people protect themselves. That's why when he jokes, it doesn't feel reckless. It feels intentional. There's a reason he never sounds surprised by anything. Scandals don't shock him. Industry drama doesn't confuse him. He reacts like someone who's already seen the pattern. And people who've already seen the pattern don't panic. They don't overreact. They don't expose everything at once. They drip information. They hint. They let others do the talking. That's how you stay safe. And safety is something 50 Cent takes seriously. He's watched careers end overnight. He's watched powerful people fall quietly. He's watched others stay protected no matter what. So when he chooses humor instead of statements, it's not because he's unserious. It's because humor gives him distance. Distance from responsibility. Distance from consequences. Distance from being forced to prove anything. A joke can't be cross-examined. A hint can't be sued. A laugh can always be explained away. That's the advantage. And 50 Cent knows exactly how to use it. That's why his tone matters more than his words. Because tone reveals intent. He doesn't sound curious. He doesn't sound confused. He doesn't sound like someone asking questions. He sounds like someone reminding people. And reminders are different from accusations. An accusation demands proof. A reminder only needs memory. That's why when 50 Cent posts, he doesn't push the story forward. He pulls it back into public awareness. Just enough for people to remember. Just enough for people to connect dots on their own. And that's the most important part. He never tells people what to think. He lets them arrive there themselves. Because conclusions you reach on your own feel more real than anything you're told. So when people brush this off as trolling, they miss the point. This isn't random behavior. This is controlled behavior. From someone who understands power, from someone who understands silence, from someone who understands exactly how much to say and how much to leave out. And once you understand that about 50 Cent, the question stops being whether he's joking. The question becomes why he's choosing to joke this way, about this person, for this long. Because people like him don't repeat themselves without a reason. Long before Instagram posts and viral captions, 50 Cent was already telling people how this industry really works. He just wasn't doing it loudly. In older interviews, when the cameras were rolling and questions sounded harmless, he would shift the conversation away from music and into something deeper. Power, control, fear. He talked about rooms where decisions are made long before the public ever hears about them. About how success isn't always earned. Sometimes it's allowed. About how certain people don't just participate in the industry, they shape it. And every time he went there, his energy changed. He didn't sound angry. He didn't sound bitter. He sounded careful, like someone who knows exactly how far a conversation can go before it becomes dangerous. What stood out to people who really listened wasn't what he said. It was what he avoided. He would describe situations without names, dynamics without accusations, power without faces. That wasn't fear. That was intelligence. Because in this industry, saying too much doesn't make you brave. It makes you exposed. 50 Cent understood early on that interviews are traps disguised as opportunities. You're encouraged to speak freely, but your words live forever. They get clipped, reframed, used against you years later. So instead of telling stories directly, he talked in principles. He spoke about people being untouchable, about how some figures are protected no matter what, about how others get erased for far less. He didn't need to point fingers. Everyone already knew the type of person he was describing, and over time something became clear. Whenever the conversation drifted toward industry power players, his tone hardened. Not aggressive, detached, as if he was describing something he had already accepted as reality. He would mention how artists stay quiet to survive, how saying the wrong thing can close doors permanently, how silence becomes a form of currency. And then he would move on. No follow-up, no explanation. Those interviews didn't go viral at the time. They weren't dramatic enough. They didn't have headlines attached to them. But years later, people started revisiting them. And suddenly, those calm statements didn't sound so casual anymore. They sounded like groundwork. Because when you compare those old interviews to his later online behavior, you see continuity, the same themes, the same restraint, the same refusal to say too much. The difference was the platform. Interviews forced him to respond. Social media allowed him to initiate. That changed everything. Online, he didn't have to answer questions he didn't like. He didn't have to finish thoughts. He didn't have to clarify intent. He could post and disappear, and that freedom made his messages sharper, not louder. So when people say his behavior came out of nowhere, that's not true. The warning signs were always there. They were just buried under calm language and indirect phrasing. What social media did was strip away the interviewer. No filter, no follow-up, no pressure to explain, just timing. And timing is something 50 Cent has always understood. He learned long ago that the most effective way to speak about power is not to confront it directly. It's to describe its effects, to show how people behave around it, to let others notice the fear without naming the source. That's why his old interviews matter so much now. They weren't random thoughts. They were foundations. And when you hear those old words today, with everything that's happened since, they feel different. They feel less like commentary and more like preparation. Preparation for a moment when he wouldn't need interviews anymore. When a single post, a single word, a single joke would say more than a full conversation ever could. And that's when the real shift began. At a certain point, more than 50 Cent stopped talking the way people expected him to. Not because he ran out of things to say, but because saying things the old way stopped making sense. Interviews come with rules, unwritten ones. You're invited to speak, but only within limits. You're encouraged to be honest, but not too honest. You're allowed to joke, but not to question power directly. And 50 Cent learned that lesson early. He watched how words could be taken out of context, how headlines could be built from half a sentence, how explaining yourself once could force you to keep explaining forever. That's a trap, because the moment you explain, you give up control. You let someone else decide which part of your words matter. So he pulled back. Instead of answering questions, he started choosing moments. Instead of conversations, he chose timing. And instead of statements, he chose silence, interrupted by something small, a post, a caption, a joke that didn't fully land. This wasn't him disappearing. It was him repositioning. Social media gave him something interviews never could. Freedom, no follow-ups, no interruptions, no pressure to be clear. Clarity is dangerous when you're talking about powerful people. Ambiguity keeps you safe. With a post, he didn't need to defend his intent. If people laughed, it was comedy. If people questioned it, it was just the internet. That's plausible deniability, and 50 Cent understands that better than most. He also understands attention cycles. He knows when a moment is hot and when it's better to wait. He knows when silence builds curiosity and when a single post can restart a conversation that never really ended. That's why his shift away from interviews matters so much. It wasn't random. It wasn't boredom. It was strategy. Talking directly forces you to take a position. Posting indirectly allows you to suggest one. And suggestions are powerful because they live in other people's minds, not yours. Once an idea is planted, you don't have to repeat it. Others will do it for you. This is where timing becomes everything. 50 Cent doesn't post constantly about the same subject. He waits. He watches. He lets the internet move on. And then, right when a name starts circulating again, he appears. Not to explain, not to accuse, just to remind. That reminder doesn't need details. It doesn't need background. It works because people already remember. This approach protects him on every level, legally, socially, strategically. If challenged, it's humor. If ignored, it still lands. If questioned, there's nothing concrete to attack. And the most important part is this: he never escalates. Escalation forces responses. Responses create risk. Instead, he keeps everything just below the surface. Enough to be noticed, not enough to be confronted. That balance is not accidental. It's the behavior of someone who knows exactly where the lines are and how close he can stand to them without crossing. So when people say 50 Cent stopped talking, they're wrong. He just changed the language. From sentences to signals, from interviews to moments, from explanations to reminders. And once you understand that shift, you realize something important. What looks like silence is actually control. And what looks like jokes is a much safer way of saying things most people are too afraid to say out loud. Because when you stop explaining yourself, you force everyone else to do the explaining for you. And that's when the message spreads the furthest. Once 50 Cent moved fully into social media, something became very clear. Instagram wasn't just a place for jokes. It was a tool. Every post had timing, every caption had weight, and every reaction was measured. This wasn't random scrolling behavior. This was someone who understood how attention works. On Instagram, 50 Cent didn't need to tell a story from beginning to end. He only needed to interrupt one. He could drop a post into an already moving conversation and let it shift direction, not by adding facts, but by changing the tone. That's what made his posts feel different. When serious topics came up, he didn't respond with seriousness. He responded with humor. One, and humor does something powerful. It lowers defenses. It makes people comfortable engaging with uncomfortable ideas. People share jokes faster than they share accusations. They laugh before they think. And by the time they do think, the idea is already planted. 50 Cent understood this instinctively. He also understood the comment section, how fans decode messages, how speculation multiplies faster than confirmation. So instead of saying what he thought, he let others say it for him. A single post could generate thousands of comments, each one pushing the conversation further than he ever could safely go himself. And he never corrected them. That silence is important, because correcting speculation would mean owning the message. Not correcting it allows distance. What really stands out is how selective he is. He posts jokes about many people, but only a few names get repeated attention. Only a few situations get revisited over time. Repetition creates meaning. If something shows up once, it's a joke. If it shows up again, it's coincidence. But when it keeps coming back, year after year, moment after moment, people stop laughing the same way. They start paying attention. Timing plays a huge role here. 50 Cent doesn't post randomly. He waits for moments when the internet is already listening, when a name is trending, when silence feels loud. That's when his posts land the hardest. Not because they add new information, but because they remind people of something they were already thinking. That's the power of social media when you know how to use it. You don't have to lead the conversation, you just have to steer it. And 50 Cent does that without ever taking responsibility for where it goes. If questioned, it's a joke. If criticized, it's entertainment. If praised, it's just posting. No commitment, no accountability, but the impact remains. Because Instagram doesn't forget. Posts get saved, screenshots circulate, moments resurface years later. And every time they do, the same questions return. Why this name? Why this timing? Why this tone? Those questions don't need answers to be effective. They only need repetition. That's why Instagram works so well for what 50 Cent is doing. It allows him to speak without speaking, to warn without warning, to remind without accusing. And the more people laugh it off, the more the message spreads. Because in a culture driven by entertainment, the fastest way to keep a serious idea alive is to wrap it in humor and let it travel freely. That's not trolling. That's control. And once you see Instagram through that lens, every post starts to feel less like a joke and more like a calculated interruption, one that never needs an explanation because it was never meant to have one. Then there was the moment that changed how people looked at everything. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even aggressive. It was quiet, and that's why it mattered. 50 Cent posted a photo of flowers, not a threat, not a rant, not a long caption explaining anything, just flowers, and one word. Warning. That single word did more than any interview ever could, because flowers don't naturally mean warning. They mean congratulations. They mean peace. They mean respect. So when that word appeared next to that image, people paused. They didn't know how to process it. Was it sarcasm? Was it humor? Was it exaggeration? Or was it intentional confusion? 50 Cent didn't help anyone decide. He didn't explain who sent them. He didn't explain why. He didn't explain what the warning was about. He let the words sit there, alone. And the internet did what it always does. It filled the silence. Some laughed it off immediately. Some said it was classic 50 Cent humor. Others noticed something unsettling. Why choose that word? Out of all the words available, why warning? That's not a playful word. It's not a neutral word. It implies risk. It implies awareness. It implies something unspoken. And when fans started asking questions, 50 Cent didn't clarify. That was the real signal. Because clarification would have shut the conversation down. Silence kept it alive. That post didn't disappear. It didn't fade away. It became a reference point. Every time something else happened later, people went back to it. Screenshots resurfaced. Captions were reread. And the word warning aged differently over time. What felt like a joke in the moment began to feel heavier later. Not because of new information, but because of repetition. That's how meaning builds. One post doesn't change perception, but one post, followed by silence, followed by similar behavior later, creates a narrative. And what made this moment even more uncomfortable was how calm he was. No anger, no fear, no urgency, just casual. As if whatever that word referred to didn't surprise him, as if it was expected. Watch, that calmness unsettled people more than aggression ever could. Because anger suggests reaction, calm suggests preparation. And once again, 50 Cent didn't push the story forward. He stepped back and watched. He let fans argue with each other. He let media outlets speculate without confirmation. He let everyone project their own interpretation onto that one word. That's powerful, because when people argue about meaning, the original message spreads further than it ever could with a clear explanation. And this wasn't an isolated moment. It fit perfectly into the behavior people had already noticed. Indirect, ambiguous, perfectly timed. If this was a joke, it was a strange one. If it was a warning, it was delivered in the safest way possible. And that's the part people can't ignore. Because only someone who understands consequences chooses ambiguity over clarity. Only someone who knows how dangerous words can be chooses a single word and stops there. 50 Cent knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that word would live longer than any sentence. He knew it would be repeated, analyzed, debated. And most importantly, he knew he would never have to defend it. Because a warning doesn't have to explain itself. It only has to exist. And once it exists, it can't be taken back. That's why this moment still gets talked about. Not because of what it revealed, but because of what it refused to reveal. And when someone refuses to explain something like that, it forces a different kind of question. Not what did he mean, but why did he feel the need to say it at all? That's where the discomfort begins. And that's why, from this moment on, people stop calling it just a joke. Most people misunderstand how jokes really work. They think jokes are meant to end conversations. But the right kind of joke does the opposite. It opens them. A joke gives you cover. It gives you an exit. It gives you a way to say something serious without being held responsible for it. And that's why the line between a joke and a warning is thinner than people realize. A warning doesn't always sound serious. In fact, the most effective ones rarely do. Because seriousness triggers defense. Humor slips past it. When 50 Cent jokes, people lower their guard. They assume there's no danger there. They laugh first and think later. That delay matters because by the time people start thinking, the message has already landed. This is where psychology comes in. A joke that points at nothing disappears. A joke that keeps pointing at the same thing starts to feel intentional. And 50 Cent understands repetition better than most. He knows that if you say something directly, it can be challenged. If you say it indirectly, it becomes interpretation. And interpretation belongs to the audience, not the speaker. That's safety. When people call his posts just jokes, they're actually proving how well the strategy works. Because jokes don't get investigated. They get shared, and shared ideas spread faster than proven ones. What makes his humor different is restraint. He never goes too far. He never gives details. He never explains the punchline. He lets discomfort sit quietly beneath the laughter. That's why some jokes don't feel funny. They feel uneasy. Because deep down, people sense there's more there than they're being told. A real joke ends with a release, a laugh, a conclusion. But his jokes don't end cleanly. They linger. They leave questions behind. And questions are powerful because they keep people engaged long after the moment passes. This is also why calling it just trolling doesn't fully work. Trolling is chaotic. It's loud. It's inconsistent. What 50 Cent does is controlled. He chooses moments when people are already paying attention. He chooses language that can't be pinned down. He chooses humor that looks harmless but carries weight. That combination isn't accidental. It's designed. A warning doesn't have to scare you to work. It just has to make you aware. And awareness doesn't always come from facts. Sometimes it comes from discomfort. That feeling that something doesn't fully add up. That feeling that someone is circling a subject without touching it. That feeling that laughter is being used to point, not to entertain. This is why people still argue about his intent. Because ambiguity keeps the conversation alive. If he clarified, the moment would die. If he accused, the focus would shift. But by staying in the middle, he controls how long the story lasts. And longevity is the real power. Warnings that are too loud burn out quickly. Warnings disguised as jokes stay alive for years. They resurface. They get reinterpreted. They age differently as context changes. And each time they come back, they feel heavier. Not because new information appears, but because the same behavior keeps repeating. That's the difference between comedy and communication. Comedy wants a reaction. Communication wants memory. 50 Cent doesn't need people to agree with him. He doesn't even need people to believe him. He just needs them to remember. And the easiest way to make people remember something uncomfortable is to make them laugh while you show it to them. That's why the jokes never fully land. That's why they never fully disappear. And that's why, over time, fewer people laugh them off completely. Because somewhere between the humor and the silence, the warning starts to feel real. Even if no one can explain exactly why. If this had happened once, no one would still be talking about it. One post can be dismissed. One joke can be ignored. One moment can be forgotten. But that's not what happened here. What made people uneasy wasn't any single post. It was the timeline, years apart, different situations, different headlines, same behavior. Again and again, the pattern reappeared. Whenever Diddy's name surfaced in a serious way, whenever the internet got quiet and tense, 50 Cent would re-enter the picture. Not with explanations, not with facts, just with presence. And that presence became familiar. People started expecting it. They would say it before it even happened. Watch 50 post something now. And when he did, it never felt rushed. It felt timed. Timing is the detail most people overlook, because timing tells you intent. Random behavior doesn't wait. Intentional behavior does. 50 Cent didn't pile on immediately. He didn't chase the headline. He waited until the moment settled, until silence felt heavy. Then he posted. That delay made it feel deliberate, like a reminder, not a reaction. And every time it happened, the same cycle repeated. Fans dug up old posts. More screenshots resurfaced. People connected dots across years, not because new information was added, but because the same signals kept appearing. That's how patterns work. They don't shout, they accumulate. One coincidence can be ignored, two can be debated, but repetition over time changes how people interpret everything that came before it. That's why earlier jokes started feeling different. That's why old captions were reread with new eyes. Nothing had changed about the words. Context had changed, and context gives weight. Another important detail is what never happened. There was no escalation, no long back and forth, no public arguments, no direct confrontations, just consistency. Consistency is boring when it's accidental, but when it's intentional, it becomes unsettling. Because it suggests discipline, someone paying attention, someone keeping track. And discipline usually comes from experience, from knowing when to speak and when to wait. That's why people stopped asking, "What does this mean?" and started asking, "Why does this keep happening?" Because patterns don't exist without purpose. Even when people disagreed on interpretation, they agreed on one thing. This wasn't random. And the longer it went on, the harder it became to dismiss. Every new moment pulled the old ones back into focus. Every silence made the jokes louder. Not because they were aggressive, but because they were familiar. Familiar behavior is comforting when it's harmless, but when it points in one direction for years, it creates tension, and tension keeps people watching. That's why the story never really ends. It just pauses, waiting for the next moment, the next silence. Oh, the next reminder. Because once a pattern is established, it doesn't need to repeat often. It just needs to exist. And the fact that people are still tracking it, still anticipating it, still debating it, tells you everything you need to know about its impact. This was never about a single post. It was about time. Time revealing intention. Time turning jokes into signals. Time making repetition impossible to ignore. And when behavior survives time, it stops being coincidence. It becomes something else, something people remember, and something people wait for, even if they don't fully understand why. One reason this keeps going is because the other side almost never responds. No statements, no explanations, no public back and forth, just silence. And silence changes how people read everything. In most situations, silence ends a story. What here it keeps it alive. Because when someone with power stays quiet, people don't assume nothing is happening. They assume calculation. They assume strategy. Silence can mean confidence. It can mean control. It can also mean that responding would only make things worse. And 50 Cent seems to understand that perfectly. He never forces a response. He never crosses the line that would demand one. He stays just far enough away that silence remains the smartest option on the other side. That balance is important. If he accused directly, the story would change. If he escalated, the dynamic would shift. But he doesn't. Instead, he creates moments that live comfortably inside silence. Moments that don't require answers, but still raise questions. That's why this dynamic feels so strange to people. On one side, laughter. On the other, nothing. And the contrast makes the laughter louder. Fans notice this immediately. They comment on it. They point it out. They ask why no one ever responds. And every time that question gets asked, the silence grows heavier. Because silence in public doesn't feel neutral. It feels intentional, especially when it's consistent. What's interesting is that this silence never looks defensive. There's no visible panic, no rushed cleanup, just distance. And distance creates mystery. Mystery keeps people watching longer than answers ever could. That's why the absence of a response matters as much as anything that's been posted. It allows imagination to fill the gaps. Some people see power, some see avoidance, some see confidence. But everyone sees something, and that's the key. Silence forces interpretation. It doesn't tell people what to think, actually, but it makes them think anyway. 50 Cent's behavior feeds into that perfectly. He never challenges the silence directly. He works around it. He posts something small, lets it echo, and steps back. No follow-up, no escalation. That way, the silence stays intact, but the conversation keeps moving. It's a rare dynamic, because most public conflicts need noise on both sides. This one survives on imbalance. One side speaks lightly, the other doesn't speak at all. And that imbalance is what gives it power. People don't rewatch this story because of drama. They rewatch it because of tension. The tension between what's said and what's not. Between jokes and silence. Between reminders and non-answers. And as long as that silence continues, every small action on the other side feels bigger than it actually is. That's why this never resolves. No, it just stretches. Because resolution would require someone to explain. An explanation would remove the mystery. Silence protects power, but it also feeds speculation. And 50 Cent knows exactly how to exist inside that space without ever forcing it to break. That's why this story feels unfinished. Not because something is missing, but because silence has become part of the message. And as long as it stays that way, people will keep watching. By this point, most people stop asking what happened. They start asking what it all means. Because after years of the same behavior, the same timing, the same restraint, the story stops being about a single person or a single post. It becomes about how power, memory, and silence work together. Some fans believe 50 Cent is warning people. Our others believe he's just playing the internet better than anyone else. Both ideas can exist at the same time. What matters is not which one is true. What matters is that the behavior never changes. He never finishes the thought. He never crosses the line. He never turns implication into accusation. And that's not weakness. That's discipline. Because once you accuse, the story ends. It moves to proof, to denial, to legal language, to closure. But when you hint, the story stays alive. And staying alive is more powerful than being resolved. That's why 50 Cent never delivers a conclusion. He doesn't need to. The internet does that for him. Fans dissect. Comment sections argue. Old posts resurface. New moments get connected to old ones. All without him saying another word. That's influence. Not forcing belief, just shaping attention. It's also why this feels uncomfortable to watch. Because there's no clear villain, no clear hero, no clear ending. Just behavior. Repeated, measured, unexplained. And people are naturally unsettled by things that don't resolve. The human brain wants closure. This story refuses to give it. Instead, it offers reminders. That power doesn't always announce itself. That warnings don't always sound serious. That silence can be louder than statements. And that laughter can carry messages no one wants to say out loud. Maybe 50 Cent knows something. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he's seen enough to recognize patterns when others still call them coincidences. Or maybe he simply understands one thing better than most. That in an industry built on image and noise, the safest way to say something dangerous is to never say it directly at all. Because once an idea is in the air, once people start noticing repetition, once memory takes over, you don't need to keep speaking. The message carries itself. And that's why, years later, people are still watching, still listening, still waiting for the next moment. Not because they expect answers, but because they've learned something more unsettling. That sometimes the most effective warning isn't loud, isn't angry, isn't obvious. Sometimes it sounds like a joke. Sometimes it looks harmless. And sometimes it's delivered by someone calm enough to never explain himself. And once you see it that way, this story doesn't end. It just stays with you. Long after the laughter fades,